There's something in youth that wants to be seen, not always in a crude or calculated way, but with that genuine need to occupy a place in the world, to feel like your own life carries weight, to have others confirm that you are someone. In the 12th century, that desire took very concrete forms. Parties, expensive clothes, weapons, war, camaraderie among equals. And in Assisi, a city in central Italy shaped by thriving commerce and family rivalries, a young man named Francis was growing up surrounded by every condition to have exactly that kind of life. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was a prosperous, well-traveled, and ambitious cloth merchant. He had built a fortune and wanted his son to carry it forward. Francis didn't seem to resist. He spent generously, threw parties, wore the finest fabrics from his father's shop, and moved through the world with the ease that money gives when you've never had to earn it. He was well-liked, charming, the kind of person who could get others excited about almost anything. But he was also sensitive, more than he usually let on. And that sensitivity, which in his youth looked like nothing more than social grace, would eventually become the nerve through which everything that changed his life would enter. The dream that drove him most was military glory. The ideals of knighthood ran strong in that era, and Francis wanted to be part of that world, brave, recognized, remembered. So when conflict broke out between Assisi and the neighboring city of Perugia, he threw himself in with enthusiasm. But the battle didn't go as he had imagined. He was captured and spent nearly a year as a prisoner. When he returned, he came back sick, physically worn down, and with something inside him that wouldn't quite settle back into place. The glory he had chased wasn't there. His body took months to recover. And while he was recovering, Francis began to notice things he hadn't been able or willing to see before. Illness does that sometimes. It stops the outward motion and forces a turn inward. Francis started pulling back from the parties, seeking out solitary places to pray, asking himself with increasing urgency what he was actually looking for. He made one more attempt at the soldier's path, enlisting in service of a nobleman for a new campaign, but he abandoned it before it even began. One night, according to tradition, he dreamed of a great hall filled with weapons and shields, and believed it was a sign of greatness to come. When he asked in the dream who all that glory would belong to, the answer redirected him. He returned to Assisi. He was no longer looking for the same thing. What followed was a period of interior searching that didn't move in a straight line. Francis prayed, wandered away from the city, circled the crumbling old churches in the surrounding hills, and during that time he had an encounter that shook him in a way no battle ever had. He came across a leper. Leprosy in that era meant radical exclusion. Lepers lived apart, marked, considered impure. Francis had avoided them his whole life, like almost everyone else did. But that day he didn't pass by. He approached the man, gave him money, and then found himself unable to stop from embracing him. Afterward, he looked back and saw no one. Whatever actually happened in that moment, the encounter broke something open in him, a boundary he had never crossed before, the revulsion at real misery, at the sick body, at the kind of exclusion that society treats as normal. Shortly after, while praying in the small ruined church of San Damiano, Francis had a spiritual experience that would mark him for the rest of his life. Tradition holds that from the crucifix in that church, he heard a voice asking him to repair its house. Francis understood this at first in a literal sense. He began gathering stones, sourcing materials, rebuilding that chapel and others nearby with his own hands. But over time he came to understand that the call ran deeper. It wasn't about walls. It was about a way of life, a way of living the gospel that the church of his time urgently needed to recover. The problem was that doing any of this required money, and Francis looked for it where he had access: his father's warehouse. He took bolts of cloth, sold them, and used the proceeds. Pietro di Bernardone did not receive this as a spiritual gesture. He received it as a betrayal and a disgrace. The conflict between the two reached a public breaking point when the Bishop of Assisi called them together for a mediation. There, in the square, in front of the whole city, Francis did something no one expected. He returned to his father not just the money, but the clothes on his back. He said that from that moment on, he recognized only one Father, who was in heaven. The bishop covered him with his own cloak. That gesture wasn't theater. It was the outward expression of a decision that had already happened inside him. Francis was leaving one world and entering another, and he was doing it without leaving any door open behind him. From that moment on, he lived among the poor. He begged for his food, worked with his hands, cared for lepers, and preached in public squares in a language anyone could understand. He didn't present himself as a teacher or a reformer. He spoke about brotherhood, about joy, about the possibility of living without possessing, and that message began to draw others in. Young men from Assisi and nearby cities started joining him. They weren't outcasts or desperate people. Some came from comfortable families, just as he had. They wanted what he had found: a coherent life, without the gap between what you believed and how you actually lived. That group would eventually become what was known as the Order of Friars Minor, a brotherhood built not on grand structures, but on movement, manual work, simple preaching, and the refusal to accumulate anything. Francis wasn't an armchair thinker. He was someone who did what he preached, and that produced an attraction that words alone never could. But he also wasn't a bitter or mournful man toward the world he had left behind. Quite the opposite. One of his most recognizable qualities was joy, a joy that didn't come from abundance, but from the freedom of not depending on it. He looked at nature with a sense of wonder that led him to speak of the sun, the moon, water, fire, and animals as brothers and sisters, not because he erased the difference between creatures, but because everything seemed to him like a language of God, a way that creation pointed back toward its creator. Near the end of his life, blind and ill, he composed the Canticle of the Creatures, a text of praise that moves through all of creation with a gratitude that has nothing resigned about it. There's a clarity in that canticle, the clarity of someone who has learned to look at things without needing to own them. In 1224, 2 years before his death, Francis went to Mount Laverna to spend time in prayer and fasting. There, according to Catholic tradition, he received the stigmata, the marks on his hands, feet, and side corresponding to the wounds of Christ's crucifixion. Tradition presents this as the most visible sign of how far his identification with the life and suffering of Jesus had reached. Francis didn't preach about it. He carried it in silence, as something that needed no explanation. He died in 1226, in Assisi, on the same ground where he had been born, and where he had begun to let go of everything that ground had given him. 2 years later, he was canonized. What Francis left behind can't be reduced to a religious order or a charming image surrounded by birds. He left a question that still unsettles: how much of what we build, accumulate, and defend as our own life ends up becoming a cage? He didn't preach poverty as punishment or as spiritual achievement. He lived it as a way of moving more freely, unburdened by what has to be protected, proved, and maintained. And that freedom, which in his time looked like madness, keeps pressing on us because the problem it answers hasn't gone away. The need to be seen, recognized, and secure still drives most human decisions. Francis didn't resolve that need by suppressing it. He transformed it, finding elsewhere what prestige never quite delivers. Assisi is still there, and the question that man asked in the 13th century is still waiting for an answer.